Okay, today we're talking about forging. Forging is the process of changing the thickness of metal, and in order to do that, you're going to start with either round or square stock metal, and you're going to treat it, or you're going to use a anvil, steel block, or steel mandrel to support it, and you're going to apply hammer strokes with forging hammers. So we have a planishing hammer, a couple sizes of Goldsmith, a bordering hammer, and a raising hammer. I think the planishing hammer and the boarding hammer and the Goldsmith hammer are the most commonly used, so we'll just move these over. So when you're thinking about changing the thickness of your metal, it has to do with what's supporting your metal and where the hammer strike is coming. It's always best to anneal the metal before you start. And if I'm going to work on a flat surface, let's say I just want to overall flatten this out, I would go ahead and use a steel block for that. Picking your hammer, the hammer is going to push the metal on this bordering hammer. It's going to push it up and down, so it will have some stretching depending on how you hammer strike. The Goldsmith hammer, on this planishing end of it, it's going to push the metal in all directions, so that may or may not be an issue when you're choosing your hammer. We'll go ahead and use this planishing hammer. When you're holding your hammer, make sure you're holding it not quite at the end and not choking up on it all the way. You're using your fingers to raise it and letting the weight of the hammer do the work. Your hammer strikes are going to overlap, so as soon as I make one hammer strike, I'm just going to move it subtly so that half of that overlaps with my previous hammer strike. The more perpendicular I can use that hammer strike, the better off, the less distortion I'm going to have on my metal. It's a slow process, so I would come through and I'm just beginning to flatten that out. So I'm going to go ahead and use the bordering hammer. It's a little easier to see. The hammer strikes with the bordering hammer. You will also get some warping, so you'll notice that that is coming up as I am doing that. If you come at an angle, you can also get some warping in terms of flaring out or changing the direction of the curve when you're forging that. If I was forging this whole piece, I would do that once, and then I would go anneal it and bring it back and forge it again. So if it's work hardened and it gets really brittle and you continue to forge it, you can end up breaking the metal. The sound of it's very important too. If you hear something like this, that means that you're hammering it too hard and you're going to lose control on that. Let's say that you have done a band ring and you want to go ahead and forge a little bit. So I started that right here. The other side of this band ring is round, so I started with a I think it was a 12 gauge brass stock. I'm going to use the ring mandrel and ring stand. And again, I'm going to use the raising or bordering hammer. I'm holding this in, and remember when I'm holding this, I'm keeping my hands away from the hammer strike. The same thing happened on the steel block. Each of the hammers is going to leave a specific patterning of marks. If you want to keep that, all you need to do is a light sanding and or polishing over the top of that. If you want to get rid of it, you're going to do a heavier sanding with your 400 and then take all of those steps up for however far you want to go on that. I'm going to go ahead and use the Goldsmith hammer. That's going to give me a little bit of a wider and it's going to give me a little bit of a flatter with less marks on it. When I do this, remember my metal is stretching, so that right now this is about 7 3/4. If I continue to do this, I'm going to end up stretching this ring probably almost to 8.5 or 9, depending on how thin I take this metal. If I want to work on an edge, I might want to bend this first and hold it and hammer that. I can also have my soldering done and work on tapering, something like that. But today we're going to work on the process of forming. Forming is changing the direction of the metal. It's not changing the thickness of it like forging is, but it's just changing the direction. The most common two functions for forming would be a ring or a bracelet. So I'm going to form this into a ring and this into a cuff bracelet. And then the third one might be some doming. So we've got the doming block here, and with the doming block, you're going to pick the appropriate size support structure. So you would not want to pick something where the metal overhung the opening. So that's going to give you a weird line right here if you were to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the largest one. I'm going to go ahead and take an appropriate doming stamp, and I'm going to use the clawfoot hammer to apply pressure in here. And with forming, it's actually going to take on the shape of whatever you form it into or around. So this just took on the curve of the inside of that. And I can continue to make it smaller. But again, if I do this and the metal's overhanging, I can end up with, and you want to make sure that this is smaller than the circumference of what it's being hammered into. I can end up with some scratching along this outside edge if this is bigger than what I'm putting that into. It's always easier if you anneal before you start forming, and if you've formed it and hammer stroke a lot of times, then you might want to anneal in between. So if you're moving it a lot and it gets work hardened, make sure you don't push it past that stress level and anneal in between times. For forming rings, we've got a couple of ways that might work. One of the easiest to get that form started, once you know you have the right length, is you're going to use a ring mandrel and this half circle wood block. I'm going to go ahead and put the ring mandrel on top of my piece. I'm going to use a leather mallet to hammer down, or I can actually, if it's a thin enough gauge, I can just push that down. Once I get that curve started, I have a couple of options. I can turn it this way, and again, hammer that, and it's going to take on the shape of whatever I am hammering it into. Or I can actually hammer the metal itself, so I can hammer strike right here, and that will push that around the mandrel itself. I'm going to use a smaller plastic mallet so I can actually see a little bit, and I hammer around there. I can also do it from the other side. I could have just as easily placed it in the ring stand, braced it from underneath. I just find this to be a little bit easier. Once I get it to here, if it is an adjustable ring, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my circle is perfect. If I am soldering it together, what I'm going to want to do is make sure that these two ends meet perfectly. And in order to do that, I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap between the two. And I'm going to go ahead and hammer this down so that eventually it just flattens out on itself, and then I can do my solder seam right here. So right now I have my ring shape right there. So for a bracelet, we're going to move over to the bracelet mandrel and kind of use the same principle. You want to use the mallet that's appropriate. So for the ring, this seems to work fine because of the thickness. For the bracelet, I tend to use the rawhide mallets. And the easiest way to start this is just by hand. If you have a lot of piercings in here, you want to be really careful because the metal is going to want to fold where you go from thick to thin, but this is just a solid piece. So just by hand, and again, I'm using the oval bracelet mandrel. If you have a round bracelet that you're making, we also have a round mandrel. So I'm just by hand. I'm just going to push this down. The reason I can do this is because I annealed it first, so the metal is very pliable. I'm also going to come over and do that. If your metal is a little bit thicker or harder to work from, all you need to do is hammer strike, and it will take on the shape of this mandrel. So if you find that you need to hammer strike here because it's either a little more hardened or it's a thicker metal, make sure you're holding the underneath side of that, because whenever you hammer in here, the tendency is for this to want to flare up. So as I come, I just turn it upside down and I hammer that down. For a cuff bracelet, the curve needs to be a little bit tighter right here and a little bit tighter right here. So we're going to go back to using what we used to form the ring mandrel in this wood block right here. And I'm going to go ahead and put this in. And again, if it's really soft and it's been annealed, I can just push down on this and it will take on that curve right here, or I can hammer it and it'll take on that curve right here. So I'm just going to spend some time from here on out just really cleaning up this curve. And sometimes I can use, depending on the size of your bracelet, sometimes I can come in here. And as I do this, I'm also work hardening it, because you don't want your bracelet to be annealed at its final stage, because then it will just come off your arm. So I'm going to put it on about the size cuff that I am. And now again, I'm just cleaning up the curve and I'm work hardening all at the same time. Reminder that my fingers are pulling up, I'm letting the hammer do the work. I'm not choked up here, I'm not holding it down here. So I'm going to continue trying it on your wrist. You want to make sure that these are filed. They're currently not filed right now. It would have been a smarter idea to file that first. But you're just going to push it into the soft area and slide it over, and then get a feel for if you need to make those curves deeper or widen them up, and it comes off the same way. Once you're finished with that, you just want to take some hammer strikes over it and get it so that the whole thing is work hardened, and then you can do your final surface work on there.